Now, a little later than billed, the last in the series of Men on Violence.
This program interviews at length men who have committed crimes of violence. Some of the things they describe may disturb. We do not broadcast this material lightly. We do so because we believe that only by probing the minds of violent men will we properly understand the causes of the problem of violence.
I had the gun behind my back, and she said, no, no. And I said, I'm sorry, Grandma, and I shot her. Then I said, well, my aunt's right beside in her room. So I ran over to her room, and she was putting on her shoes, and I shot her in the head.
Have you got any idea how many people there were?
I can count 144.
That you killed?
Yes.
In August 1987, a small English town witnessed an extreme kind of violence rarely seen in Britain. Michael Ryan shot dead 16 people and then killed himself. What can make a man kill on this scale and include complete strangers among his victims? Could this kind of violence become more common in Britain? To try to see what lies behind mass murder, we went to a country where this kind of violence is now no longer unusual, the USA. On the 1st of August 1966, Charles Whitman shot dead 12 people and wounded 34 from the top of a tower in Austin, Texas. Since then, this kind of attack has become increasingly common. In 1984, in the worst attack yet, James A. Huberty walked into a McDonald's restaurant in California and killed 21 people and wounded 19. Eventually, he was shot dead by the police. What is the motivation for attacks like this, and another form of mass murder, serial killing, where a murderer kills one victim at a time over a long period? Psychologist Oliver James talked to mass murderers to find out. First, a man who killed his family in one attack.
And I couldn't breathe at all. I couldn't even get that much air in. And I jumped up and my head felt like it was exploding. And my eyes, it felt like someone had reached in behind my eyes and was squeezing them. And they were sliding forward. I thought that I was ready to die. And I was slamming on my chest and working my arm. And before it always helped a little. But now I couldn't breathe at all. And everything was echoing. And so I knew that it was then that I had to do it. And so I said, okay, Satan, okay, give me a chance. I'll do it now.
Why did Henry kill his family? The basic motivation was probably little different to that of a murderer in this country. In last week's program, which looked at murder, we discovered that killing often occurs when it seems that an extreme choice is presented to the killer between killing or being destroyed, either physically or more often psychologically. Henry's background was unusual. He never knew his father, and his mother was mentally ill.
She thought she was Queen Elizabeth.
Queen Elizabeth?
Yeah.
What, the British Queen?
Yeah.
Queen Elizabeth I or Queen Elizabeth II?
The one that's in Britain now.
His uncle, who lived in the same house, was similarly ill.
He thought that World War II was still going on. And he thought that we were at war with the Japanese.
Apart from the difficulties of coping with these kinds of delusions, Henry's life was full of rejection and violence from the whole family, making him disturbed and even prone to hallucinations.
Did she cuddle you and put you in bed and look after you?
Very rarely. Usually she was kicking me out of bed and yelling at me, and every morning she'd wake me up hitting on me and yelling. I used to sleep in the crib until my brother was there with his meat cleaver. After that, I always slept with my mother.
What were you doing with the meat cleaver?
He was teasing me. And,
How?
I thought it was one of my hallucinations. There was a coat rack, a bunch of coats hanging on a rack at the foot of my crib. And I was looking at them, and they parted. And he sort of had a hat on and a meat cleaver, and he was smiling, and the light was hitting his face. My uncle, he'd throw me on the floor and pour soap powder in my eyes.
Henry was removed from his family and taken into care. But that produced no improvement.
And on my first day, a guy punched me in the eye and blackened my eye. Then another kid tried to bury me in the sandbox. And I got in a fight with another kid, and the people that ran the place put us in this room and locked the doors and had us fight it out.
Henry's life in care continued in the same vein until he felt overwhelmed by threat, to the point where he didn't want his own life to continue.
By the time I was 15 or 16, I constantly thought of suicide. I saw my whole life as a failure and pain, and I saw no future.
But instead of simply resorting to suicide, Henry diverted his destructiveness outward.
So at that point, I started thinking, well, as long as I'm going to die, why not turn it into something where I can show them how they had hurt me? Attack some of the people that had hurt me previously and kill them and then kill myself.
When Henry was 18, he chose to return home. By now, he was himself very disturbed.
I started praying to God, asking him to give me strength and power and stuff like that, and that I'd save the world. And I wasn't getting any answers. So I started listening to rock and roll songs on the radio. And I'd ask God a question, and I would say, God, I know that you know the question before I ask it, and that you can have the DJ play any songs to answer the question. Eventually, I wasn't getting any help from God, so I thought I'd make him act by turning to Satan. And I said, Satan, give me some money from the lottery, because I'd never worked in my life. By the time I was of working age, I was already getting sick. I said, Satan, let me win the lottery. I'll buy guns and carry out your mission.
What was Satan's mission?
To hurt people and to kill people. The day after I asked Satan to let me win the lottery, me and my grandmother hit for $25,000. And that blew my mind. And at first I jumped up and said, Yahoo! And then I said, uh-oh, this means I'm going to have to use the money to get weapons and kill people. And that thought blasted me down. I was thinking, my God, now I have to actually do it. It's one thing to think it, it's another to do it. I put it in the bank and left it there. And I said, I'm not going to hurt anyone. And then I began to experience breathing trouble. I could never breath. I began to think that Satan was showing me that he could just kill me like that, as easy as that, just make me stop breathing or make my heart stop or, whatever. And so I decided to finally buy the guns. So I went and got an age of majority card because I needed ID, and I went to the gun store.
Is that all you need to get a gun?
Just ID. So I went in the gun store and I said, I want the gun that shoots the most bullets and has the most power. And so he gave me a Beretta pistol. And he said, you can't get it for a week. I had to sign for him. He said...
What was the form? What was it?
To to say that I had never been in trouble with the law and never been in a mental institution.
Do you think you would have killed anyone if you hadn't been able to get hold of guns?
No. I never would have hurt anyone. Because by then I was sick, I was weak, and I was looking for the easiest way and also to hurt the most people.
Like other murderers, British and American, Henry had been overwhelmed by a sense of impending catastrophe, in his case partially induced by his delusions. What made his violence more lethal was the easy availability of guns in the United States. If guns were as easily available in this country, undoubtedly we too would suffer a higher murder rate. But by no means all mass killing is attributable to liberal gun laws. Other factors must explain this man, who has killed on a massive scale without using guns.
So I said, well, before we go, I'm going to go get myself another bottle. And he said, no, you can't do that. No, wait a minute. You're not going to tell me what I can do and what I can't do. He said, I said, you're not going. We got into it. I picked up a rock, and I crushed his skull.
Did you mean to kill him?
Yeah. Yeah, because I thought he was against me.
How did you feel after you killed him?
You feel anything. He's just another dead body.
You didn't feel any kind of pity for him? This guy was trying to help you.
No. I thought he was wrong in telling me I couldn't do something that I was entitled I wanted to do.
If I'd been there and come up to you and said, don't you think you slightly overreacted here? You just killed this guy. Just because he's trying to, and he's trying to do something to your own good. What would you have said?
I would have told him the same thing I just told you, that I think he was wrong in telling me, no, you can't go and get another bottle.
But if I persisted and said that...
I tell you the same thing. He was wrong.
It's one thing to be in the right. It's another thing to actually kill someone else for being in the wrong, if they're not physically threatening
I killed
you.
a lot of people. And I never had any remorse for one of them. And I never will.
What is it that explains Joe's extraordinary readiness to use extreme violence in a minor dispute? In part, the answer may be that in America, a greater use of violence in general is tolerated.
It's part of our cultural heritage in America that men should be quick to resort to physical means of resolving disputes. The pioneer history of this country, the heroes that this country has always had, have been active, independent, self-sufficient men of action. And that is a role to which American boys are trained. Boys are supposed to learn how to defend themselves, supposed to know how to be aggressive, and supposed to use aggression to resolve disputes. Indeed, many of the behaviors that are typical of upper status Englishmen are seen by Americans as rather effeminate, because Americans are so attuned to the notion of being masculine in all things. Even the slightest mannerism matters.
The suggestion that American culture is simply more violent than our own does not, of course, explain why even in America some men are much more violent than others. Joe was predisposed to violence by personal factors. He shared with other violent men the kind of upbringing that can shape a man for violence. He hated his mother, for example.
She was a whore.
When you say that, you mean quite
She
literally?
was a whore. Guys would come to the house when my dad left, and they'd give me a little money, or they'd tell me to go to movies or something like that, but, kids sneak back and stuff like that, and I could never bring myself to tell my father what was actually going on.
He didn't know?
No.
Did you used to actually see her having intercourse with these men?
Quite a few times.
How did that make you feel?
Sick. I hated her.
Joe felt sympathy for his father, who fought with his mother, but the conflict he saw was itself a further bad influence on him.
Did they have a lot of arguments before they split up?
Oh, yeah, they had arguments.
Were they ever physical violence?
Yeah.
What would happen?
You see, I'm saying my father didn't know. Now that you say that, maybe he did know, because sometimes he'd beat the living shit out of her. She used to tell me I was just like my father. I was no good. I was a bum. She'd send me out to shovel snow, and I had to give her all the money. She used to send me out to go in the garbage and pick up the nickel bottles and make sure she got the money. Money. That's all she wanted.
Soon, and in the kind of reaction common to many violent men, British and American, Joe turned to revenge.
I did a lot of dirty things that, she wouldn't know, like if she got a new pair of shoes or something, like she they disappeared, new dress or something, whatever I could do.
You'd do anything you could to hurt her?
I burnt her whole bedroom a couple times.
You felt this enormous resentment towards your mother. Why didn't you just kill her? You were killing everyone
Because
else.
of my father. If I did that, it might have killed him. And I love my father more than anything in the world.
And at this time, your father was still alive?
Yes. If I had gotten out and he was dead, I'd have killed her. I'd have chopped her up in pieces.
In common with many men from a disruptive, neglectful background like this, Joe became delinquent at an early age.
They put me in Catholic school. And I ended up robbing the school, robbing the church.
Were you violent at school at all? Did you get involved in fights?
A lot of fights.
Did you have knives at that time?
No. We used our hands.
Do you remember feeling angry at that age? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. I was very paranoid that somebody would find out, and they'd say something to me in the classroom or something like that.
Find what out?
About her.
Your mother being...
This is hard for me. I hate to talk about her.
Yeah. You were worried that your friends would
Find out.
And they'd humiliate you if they... That's what you were worried about?
Yes, sir.
Many men in Britain must also feel anger, formed by experiences similar to Joe's. But in Britain, mass murder of the kind that Joe carried out is very rare. And in Joe's case, even a culture which encourages the use of violence, combined with the kind of background common to many violent men, would be unlikely to explain his extraordinary violence. Something else must account for Joe. It may be that another striking difference between British and American society is a contributory factor. There is a huge gap between the extremes of wealth and poverty in the United States. Though that by itself should not cause violence, the attitudes that accompany that gap may have that effect.
American culture places tremendous emphasis on winning. It's part of the success ethic. It's part of the competitive spirit of American society, which I think is in part responsible for productivity and great achievement. It may also be responsible for serial killing. We're talking about losers in one way or another, people who haven't made it in a socially acceptable way. They instead turn to illegitimate ways of feeling successful. Too often that means taking the lives of other people in order to achieve a feeling of superiority, dominance, control. And that's what you find as a common element in serial killing in the United States. Often you don't find that in England.
Violence is an extreme way of attempting to gain control and power. In a society like America, where success, having power and control, is paramount, the level of violence may accordingly be higher. The man responsible for the assassination of Robert Kennedy in 1968 made just that point after the attack. Joe seems to have been driven by a similar motivation to succeed through violence where he failed by other means. He served 25 years in prison for a murder he committed in 1953, and his attitude when he was released was significant. He felt himself to be a loser, and his remedy was extraordinary.
It was about 1978, and you came out feeling hateful, as you put it. So what happened then?
I went around the country killing people.
Now, did you set off saying, I am now going to set off and kill lots of people, or how was it?
Yeah, that's how I set it off. I was going to get even with the world.
Didn't it bother you to see people in pain?
It didn't bother me a bit.
The expression on their face?
Sometimes I liked it. In fact, I enjoyed it.
Because enjoyable, because
it would let some of the hatred come out of me.
It makes you feel better to see them suffering.
Not feel better, no. It's just
enjoyable.
Relaxed me.
Joe killed automatically and without any feelings of remorse.
You never were attached to anyone?
No.
Because I would have thought if I was killing that many people that there would have been some very horrible, heart-rending moments.
That's the way you would have thought. But you're not me, and you haven't got the feeling and the hate inside me. You haven't got that. You'd have to live that.
If you were set free today, if you walked out of here with me now, would you be safe, do you think?
Absolutely not. There's a few that I'd kill just as soon as I look at them.
Particular people you've got in mind?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You think you'd go and find them and kill them?
Oh, I could find them.
And you kill them because?
Because I want to kill them.
Joe's attitude to the use of violence as a compensation for lack of success is most clearly seen in his feeling about one particular man he said he'd like to kill. Joe had been made ill by a tainted soft drink produced by a big American company, and he wanted revenge because he thought that the company thought he was worthless and were looking down on him. It was to be the revenge of a loser.
Because if I got out, I would go to that guy and I'd tell him, I'm Joe Fisher. You tried to poison me with this shit and soda. Boom. And I'd have no compassion. I wouldn't care anything about him. I'd be glad. Because if they're selling it to just prisons cheap and they admit that they couldn't sell it to the public because it's too old in the cans, how do you know they're not selling it to kids' hospitals? How do you know they're not selling it to a mental institution here? I'd kill that son of a bitch just as soon as look at him.
Mass killing may be a combination of the same factors which predispose to violence in other societies and a disordered expression of the American need to succeed taken to extraordinary lengths. American culture, with its ethos of success and lack of restraint, may be responsible not only for the greater violence there, but the lack of remorse or guilt that in Britain might restrain a man from further killing.
When I first started to study homicide many years ago, I became interested in the fact that a very, very small proportion of the homicide offenders I studied committed suicide. It was something like 3%.
This is in America?
In America. Committed suicide, either before being arrested by the police or while in a county jail awaiting trial and so forth. Whereas at the same time, in England, nearly 1/3 of the persons who committed homicide also committed suicide.
Now, what does that suggest?
That sense, there's a sense of guilt associated with engaging in behavior that is so alien to the general culture around you that is much more felt in Western Europe, and particularly, I think, in the UK, than in the United States.
If British culture does not and continues not to place the same emphasis on winning and individual success as American culture, it may be that events like those at Hungerford will remain unusual in Britain. However, Britain may be changing. Attitudes to success, winning and losing, and how winners are rewarded may be in the process of being recast. If British culture were to become more similar to American culture, then more of the ugly violence that disfigures American society might become a feature of our society, too.
you ever behave violently? If so, LWT wants you to take part in our major news survey. The information you give us will be used to improve services. Send for the survey by writing with your name and address to Men on Violence, Free Post, Box 50, London SE1 9BR. That's Men on Violence, Free Post, Box 50, London SE1 9BR. The survey also includes a section for victims of violence and does not ask you to give your name and address.